Hi everyone, welcome to this week's issue of the Birthday Salon. Today we have Associate Prof. Ying Ying from NTU Linguistic and Multilinguistic Studies to talk about her article that was published in Today. It's called What is Our Singaporean Mother Tongue? So before I pass the time over to Ying, I'm just going to ask the first question. Oh yes, I'm Hazira. You already know Chris, he will appear soon.
Hello.
But yes, so I'm just going to ask the first question. What motivated you to write the piece?
This was actually an academic piece that was written a while ago. It was published in 2014, and I probably had the research done sometime between 2012 2013. One of the things that bothered me during that time, I was younger, this was like 8 years ago, was that I think if you look around you, there's just generally lots of people speaking English, right? And that was also during the time that I was away from Singapore a lot. I had stints overseas, mostly in the US. And what struck me a lot was, because I had to take lots of cab rides from place to place. And Americans in general, taxi drivers, very friendly. They like to ask questions. So usually they'll look at me and say, yeah, okay, like Asian, okay? So they typically ask, say, oh, where are you from? And I'll say, oh, I'm from Singapore. And then they'll be like, oh, Singapore, what do they speak there? You speak English really well. And usually to that, my response would be, oh yeah, so do you. Right? Because it's almost like, what do you expect? And to some extent, it always shocked them. I know it's a little bit like tongue-in-cheek rude, but on the other hand, it's also sort of borderline stereotypically not so nice. Okay. And it got me thinking, is it just because of my skin color, or is it just because of where I come from, that we are then defined by what we really should be speaking? And usually they follow up with some kind of trying to mend fences and be like, oh, right, so you speak English, so is English your mother tongue? And that's when I get stumped quite a lot, because if you think about the way we conceptualize mother tongue, right? We grew up in the Singapore education system, and I've always been told, as many children are told, that your mother tongue is your other language that you actually study in school. So your second language. So in my case, it will have to be Mandarin Chinese. But yeah, sure, I speak it. And I'm quite proud to say that I actually speak it quite well. But do I speak it enough in my everyday life that I start to think in Chinese, or that it's my first go-to language when I want to express myself? Probably not. If I have to hold a long conversation in Chinese, which I have before, I don't do that well. It's slightly embarrassing, right? But I can hold a long conversation in English. I can express myself very well in English. And that makes me wonder, why am I so hesitant to then say that English is not my mother tongue? I mean, like, that is this whole dilemma, and I don't like myself having to even be stumped by that question, but I'm stumped, and I responded so easily. I was like, oh, you speak really well in English. Yeah, so do you, right? But so why do I get to the point where I cannot answer what is my mother tongue? So it got me thinking, should there be a way of conceptualizing mother tongue? And certainly in the Singaporean context, the way we think about mother tongue is very government-driven, policy-based. But that doesn't necessarily define the way we actually use language to express ourselves, and the way we use language to also identify ourselves in a way. So I started my research on looking at language habits and the way Singaporeans in general tend to use language in different ways. And that's how I came up with the 4 conditions for thinking about the mother tongue. And I hope at least that would allow us to think a little bit more deeply about what the mother tongue really means, rather than because my school made me do mother tongue as a second language. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Chris, do you have a question?
Not so much of a question, but just very blown away, Ying Ying, as how you shared your narrative. I think it was so captivating, you know. Funny story simply because I resonate deeply with that. I had the privilege and opportunity of studying in the US as well for a short period of time. And I remember this very well-meaning TA, so a teaching assistant, was teaching a class on some compulsory module on English. She had this very endearing nature and she said something like, so, you know, we talk about lingua franca. And so all of us here, you know, most of us are Americans, our lingua franca is English. And our friend over here from Singapore, his lingua franca will be Singaporeese, you know. So when I heard that, I was, what? You know, so... But I just thought it was so interesting because, yeah, the cab ride narrative that you're sharing and how there was that dissonance that you mentioned about, you know, mother tongue. And perhaps then I'm called to then reflect about maybe my concept of mother tongue is quite different from theirs, you know. And my mother tongue, as you already pointed out, is very much determined by my skin color or my ethnicity. And when you mentioned that having a long conversation in Mandarin Chinese is difficult for you, I face the same for just short conversations. You can ask any of my Chinese teachers, it's terrible. So, you know, I think more so because I think some of us come from very mixed racial backgrounds. And so I like the way, Ying Ying, that you phrase implicitly that some criteria perhaps about the usage of mother tongue also is dependent on its frequency of use. And I think that is very interesting because back home as well, I grew up in a family that my mom would only speak to me in English when I was younger and my dad would only speak to me in Chinese. That was their way of trying to make me, I guess, bilingual. But it failed tremendously because I spent a lot more time with my mother than my father, so my Chinese is not very good. So, but yeah, just throwing it back to you, Hazira, whether or not you have any particular questions or follow-up also as well.
Okay, I think the next question I'm going to ask is about the 4 conditions. So for everyone that's curious, right, the 4 conditions are, the first one is, what's the first language to which I was exposed from birth? Second one is, what is the languages in which I am most proficient? The third one is, what is the language that I use the most? And 4, what is the language that I would say is mine? So, Ying, you shared that the 4 conditions came from your research. Were there particular things in your research that informed any of the 4 conditions?
Well, generally speaking, those were some of the themes, I suppose, that were being thrown out by people who actually did research on mother tongues. And within the linguistic circle, I think scholars who are linguists in general, over the last, I would even say as far as 70, 80 years, the term mother tongue is extremely loaded. Lots of people don't like to use it, right? Because there is this whole genetic relationship. It almost suggests that you're born with it because your mother, right, gives birth to a child. And so that birthing metaphor creates this very intrinsic link. It's almost essentialistic. If you are a child of this mom, that's something that you can't change. So your mother tongue is also something that cannot be taken away from you. And linguists in general, I think, use the term, but use it with some level of qualification. And so across the years, across the decades, people were trying to look at the mother tongue from slightly different ways. Then came terminologies like first language, second language, heritage language, and whatnot. So the whole list comes, right? Because people are trying to disassociate themselves from this notion of being tied to the mother. And for me, I don't necessarily think that it's a bad term. I just think it demands a little bit more explication. So I dug around and I looked at how people wrote about it. And in fact, if you don't give up the term and you just draw out the essence of what these scholars have come up with, it quite neatly distills themselves into these 4 concepts that I was talking about, right? So the idea of inheritance, because you can't deny that it is, your mother tongue is something that you have to inherit from someone. But it doesn't have to be from your mother. It can be from your father. It can be from your grandparents. But there is that whole lineage that we really shouldn't cut ourselves from in a way, which is why I think that's one of the key conditions that we need to at least stick to. And the other one is expertise, which is, I mean, you can inherit a language, but that language can be something that's very dear to you because that sort of is something that's been passed down by your folks. But it may not be a language that you speak well in because you have not been educated in it. So you may have a few words that you are very fond of, but you may have another language that you are truly proficient in. And that could be the language that you then pass on to your next generation, and that becomes your child's mother tongue, right? So I think from that, you have the two conditions that are sort of tied quite neatly together, but yet at the same time separate, because they deal with two separate domains of what makes language something that belongs to you. Which then brings us to my fourth condition. I'm skipping the third one first. The fourth condition, which is on identification. What is the language that you would think is really yours? Right, there needs to be a sense of ownership. Like when I say, oh, I really like this language, but that's quite different from saying this language is mine. Because once you have ownership of the language, then it becomes something that you actually take hold of and you do things with. And that can only be done if you have the third condition, which is where you have language used in many different domains and functions of your life. So be it using it with your loved ones, writing love letters to your partner, or singing songs in the language that you love, and watching movies and listening to the radio, writing a diary, or even counting. Counting is actually very interesting. What language do you count in? If you have to tell me to tell you my telephone number in another language, I can't. I literally have to write it down and then I will read it out to you. But my go-to has to be English. Why? Because it's something that is really in your daily functioning brain. So the four conditions coming together allows you to then explore a whole range of possibilities, because it may not necessarily be that one language that people think that, oh, you only have one mother tongue. And that's always been the biggest problem of research in this area, that there is an assumption that if you have a mother tongue, there's only one. But look, we are a multilingual society, right? Many of us, I think Chris said earlier, people have mixed backgrounds. And if you have mixed backgrounds, what's stopping you from having two mother tongues? Just because your mom and your dad speak two different languages doesn't mean that you can't have both as your mother tongue. What happens if you're in a three-generational family where your grandparents speak a different language, and then your mom and dad speak a different language, and you happen to speak all three really well? Great. All three can be your mother tongue, because all of them fit the different conditions for making the language yours.
It's reminded me of this experience I've had growing up, because I used to live with my grandmother and she cooks a lot. So when she sends me out to get groceries, the list is in Malay, which is not really a problem for most things. But when it comes to like herbs or like vegetables, I'm just like, I don't know what these are, because the supermarket will only have the labels in English.
Yeah.
And that was something that I personally like struggled with quite a bit. So I would, before I would go, I would like Google at home like what the translation is, because my grandmother wouldn't know. And I couldn't like, that was not the time when I could take pictures and send it to her.
Right.
So, and the thing is now, because I started cooking for myself, when I read recipes in English, and I'm just like, what herb is this in Malay? Because sometimes that's how you would ask, like if I want to talk to my grandmother about it, be like, how do I express what this is, instead of me having to show a picture to her.
Right. Yeah, I'm just thinking about my whole growing up experience as well. If you have to ask me what is the first language that I actually spoke, it will have to be Teochew, because I grew up with my grandparents. And it's the language that I spoke to my grandparents, and I spent a lot of time with them because parents were working, and I was left to my grandparents' care, and I played and I talked to them. The neighbors were all Teochew speakers, and everyone knew me as the Teochew girl who likes to sit by the door. And I mean, it's true. Apparently, I was quite a crazy kid. I would just sit by the door and say hello to all the neighbors walking past. And
wow.
Yeah, crazy kid, right?
No, we need to have more of that, though. We need to have more of that in our society today.
And the neighbors apparently were just, oh yeah, that's the Teochew kid, who likes to say hello to people. So, and for the longest time, from what I remember, Teochew was my go-to language, because that was what I grew up with. So what would be in fact, the first language that I spoke must to be Teochew, right? But is it my mother tongue now? I can't say it is because my grandparents passed away. I no longer speak it. I could, if I meet my old aunts and uncles who still speak the language, during Chinese New Year, I may, try conversations. I can still sustain a fairly short, uncomplicated conversation in Teochew, but that's about the most I can do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Ying Ying. I'll just follow up a bit more. I think your sharing was very moving for me. So when I grew up with my grandparents as well, father's side, sometimes they would converse in Hakka, and I would understand it when I was younger, and I would be able to reply a little bit. But because of, I think, your criteria as well, right, that the lack of usage or utility of it has made the language almost alien to me. That being said, though, I think one element in which and this is not a critique of your criteria, obviously, but it's something that I'm hearing you share as it came about is, I wonder whether there is also space to consider the affective element of the language. Because I think for me, just like what you shared about Teochew, something about Hakka for me that if I hear it, I know, and then it sends back this wave of nostalgia and things like that, And I know maybe in a more research academic setting, it might be quite hard to quantify or to make sense of these affective elements. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on this, where the link between language and the affective emotions and things.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I've struggled with this for a while as well, because I think affect is such an important element in any kind of not trying to feel strongly about a language. And it is one thing to say that I have affection towards Hakka because Hakka was my grandparents' language. But if you want to apply the same affection, like affection as a criteria, then it also makes me wonder, how does that differentiate from, say, someone who say, I really love Korean because I like that Korean star, right? Or I love French because French sounds so romantic. I want to have a French boyfriend. And you hear all these reasons, and there's so many ways and reasons to like a language. So I think affection is important, but affection is important insofar as, for the definition of a mother tongue, to be built into the idea of a heritage. Yeah. And I think that's where it works, because even though you have some kind of affection for Korean, you are unlikely to say that Korean is your mother tongue. And even if you do, people are going to look at you strangely and say, are you nuts? You're not even Korean, right? But if you say Hakka is my mother tongue, people give you a long rope and say, yeah, sure, why not? Even though you hardly speak it, but you can make claims to it. Why? Because your heritage allows it. I think that's where the affective component comes in, and that's what makes the difference between affect for a heritage that belongs to you and affect for something else that may be modern and nice but doesn't belong to you.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm painting a very broad brush here, obviously, but I think there's a nature of policymakers or human beings in general to try to compartmentalize, to simplify, to categorize, right? And I'm wondering also from the Chinese perspective, to say that my mother tongue is Mandarin, for example, I think by nature of that already, at least in my grandparents' generation, might already be not a very satisfactory answer, because that in itself already may not be entirely accurate in their perspective, because there's so many different kinds of dialects that one could actually claim as one's mother tongue. I'm wondering also for Hazira's perspective, like in the Malay community also, do you see such things happening also, like oversimplification of mother tongue or like things like that?
I think from my personal experience, it's not the same, because I think for my grandparents don't strongly identify with one of the cultural groups that you tend to lump together under Malay. So they're not Javanese, or they don't identify as Boyanese, but I know friends or I know people who do. And because those groups have languages of their own, right? So to them there's a great loss when you use Malay versus when you use Javanese or when you use Boyanese. And I think there are people who are around my age who can speak who can understand bits of it. I'm not one of those people, because my grandparents have never spoken either any of those languages. But if there's one thing that my grandparents I think if there's one struggle that I do have with Malay, it's that the language that I grew up speaking is very different from the language I learned in school. I think this is probably something that quite a few people might identify with, in that there are a lot of words that my grandparents use that I don't know if are actual Malay words. But the funny thing is, I've used them with my friends, I've used them with like, you know, my aunts and my uncles. So I know they must exist. I just don't know how to spell them. And I don't know, you know, I don't know if I can use them in compositions. And I think I just never like settled that. Mostly because like my relationship with studying mother tongue in school was very tumultuous. It's gotten much better since. It's gotten much better since. I think I enjoy speaking Malay now as opposed to when I was in school. But like, I think about it sometimes, like, does this word actually exist? I don't know. And I don't know how to find out either, because I don't really trust the dictionary to be like, you know, the thing that decides.
I was going to say that I think Hazira's problem with the learning Malay in school and speaking Malay outside is different. It's a whole different problem. I think we're just talking about two different varieties of Malay here, which is quite a common phenomenon we get here anyway. And I think Malay scholars, linguists actually have been doing a lot of work on this and trying to sort of separate the two. And it's true too that I think in your own family, you may not necessarily have this kind of strong association with, say, the Bugis or the Boyanese or the Japanese, but certainly with many other Malay communities, I think that is that strong sense that Malay is not the language that can represent them simply because they have their own languages. And I think that is the same for the Chinese community and certainly for the Indian communities here as well. For the Chinese community, I think even the term dialect is something that I don't use. Because it's a highly politicized term, and it's also a term that has been given to these languages as a way of trying to make them part of this big Pan-Chinese language, right? So you say, I mean, in the linguistic definition, a dialect of a language is where you have two different dialect speakers, they speak the same language, and they can still understand each other. So we have the condition of mutual intelligibility here. So for example, a British English speaker would be speaking British English, and say American speaker would be speaking American English. They are both speaking English, but just speaking two different types of English. And they can understand each other, right? There's some differences, but they can understand each other. So we say that British English and American English are dialects of English. Wow. And we have the same definition for all kinds of other languages as well. So you have Canadian French is a dialect of, say, French. Yeah, but Chinese languages here, they actually all belong to different language families. I mean, we're talking even about a family tree that is completely separate. So Cantonese belongs to the Yue family. Hokkien and Teochew belong to the Min family. And even then within the Min family, you have Southern Min. So, and various other languages, even within the Southern Min family, you have all the distinction from the different parts. So just from a typological perspective, they are already different. So to call them dialects of Chinese itself is in a way trying to force everyone to be one big happy family, when the fact is it is not. We are just completely different. I mean, I had to learn Cantonese because I'm not a Cantonese speaker. And I remember when I was learning Cantonese was as foreign as Greek is to me, you know? I mean, I have no idea what the Cantonese speaker was speaking, and literally learned it. Even just the tone system of Cantonese. I mean, Cantonese has like 9 tones, and Teochew has 8 tones. Mandarin Chinese has 4 tones. I mean, just on that structure of those languages, they are different. And even those tones don't overlap. We are talking about completely different musical system here, right? So how do you expect that people who speak Cantonese and people who speak Teochew would understand each other? They don't, unless you literally speak both languages. So to call them dialects of Chinese is in itself problematic. And there are lots of reasons for why people did that. Part of the reason why was because China did it first. But China was going through a language reform, and they were trying to push Putonghua to be like the Pan-Chinese national language. So Singapore followed suit because they needed to sort of take China as the lead, especially when it comes to the development of the Chinese language. So to call Chinese languages dialect was in part to unify the Chinese community because it was so diverse, and historically the Chinese communities here were in so many different groups. They had sort of clan associations that were tied to them, and when people started speaking different languages, conflict happened. So you cannot unite a group of people with multiple tongues. You need to have one single language, right? And the more variety you have, the more differences you have, the more difficult it is to get everyone together. So what's the best thing to do? Just call everyone dialects of a Chinese language. What would that Chinese language be? Mandarin Chinese. Right? So the whole process was in fact a very historically motivated, politically motivated process, but not linguistically driven at all. I mean, there are in fact no linguistic facts behind the labeling of these languages as dialects. In part, for me, it is I've written about this before, it's a denigration process as well, because the Speak Mandarin campaign happened in 1979. And the Speak Mandarin campaign at that point was very firmly to make sure that people actually picked up Chinese, right? Mandarin Chinese. So what do you do at that time if you had to get people to do it when Mandarin Chinese was not spoken by a large part of the population? Many people out there, the uncles and aunties who were in the hawker center, they certainly didn't speak Mandarin. So the way to encourage them is to say, hey, by the way, whatever they are speaking right now is not really proper. It's a dialect, and because it's a dialect, it's time for you to learn a proper language. And even if you can't, make sure that your child does. And that was why I think the whole mindset that these are dialects have actually stuck very strong.
Oh gosh, Ying Ying, thank you so much for that reframing. I think that point was one of the key takeaways I have of this conversation today, because what I'm hearing from you is also the politics of language, and you rightly pointed out so well. And I think the way that you were able to share that example of British English and American English as dialects, I think the far majority of people that I would know would actually say it's just accents. But I think your point is such a crucial one, because it's the same language but different kinds of like variations. For me, I think the greatest takeaway of what you just shared, though, before I pass the time back to Hazira, is the kind of complexity and nuance that is missing or eradicated the minute one tends to unify a certain kind of broad umbrella of a language. Right now, I'm just thinking about maybe a space or something that allows for students these days to even just consider the possibilities of tracing back their historical language lineage. You know, it's interesting in an academic exercise, and also in a form of identity creation and construction in that sense.
Yeah, no, I like the point about the lineage. I think this is just like an observation, right? Because why I think with what you've shared, especially with the whole like Speak Mandarin campaign and the relegation of other Chinese languages that are not Mandarin Chinese to dialects, what happens is that it like in a sense, it invalidates how I think a lot of the older generation might feel about this. And I think like bringing it back to the 4 conditions that you originally suggested really ties to the first and the last one. So the idea of inheritance and the idea of ownership, right? Because then the languages that you inherit are like, I think for quite a few people, maybe for quite a few people, I guess like Mandarin Chinese might not have been a language that they inherited. And because when you don't inherit it or when you don't speak it at home, then it's very difficult to gain a sense of ownership over it.
Absolutely.
I think the thing about the sharing so far that's made me most like, the word is mind blown, but I'm not sure there's a nicer way to put it. Is that you don't have to just have one mother tongue. Which is why I think like Chris's suggestion of having space for students to like trace their lineage and think about where they like to think about what language people before them used to speak might be an interesting exercise, partly to understand the inheritance bit and how that like filters into what you use, like how you use the language, and also the ownership. The question I have is kind of like mostly related to the idea of the shifting mother tongue policy, but I'm not sure if it like moves too far away from what you might be intending to ask, Chris. So you can,
I think, okay, so before we go there, I think I just have one quick question for Ying. And by all means, Ying, just feel free to just throw it back to us if you feel that it's a topic worthy for further conversation, right? Not just meant to be a Q&A. I'm just curious from your perspective, especially when you mentioned that language drives potentially thought, and thought drives behavior and things like that. Is it possible, at least in an academic research setting, does scholarship have any perspective about whether or not we can hold more than one language in our mind at the same time? Well, why I say that is because just now you were quite right by saying that, the language that you learn and you grew up with and you inherit, it also becomes a language in which your mind operates, right? You think in that language, you count in that language. And I remember when I was spending an extended period of time in a Chinese-speaking community overseas, I realized that after 2 weeks of staying there, my thought processes became a Mandarin, and I have never experienced that before. And I literally wrote it in my journal, what's happening that I'm thinking in Mandarin now, and it's such a curious situation because 20 years in my life at that point in time, I never encountered that. And I think my Chinese teachers would have been so proud of me and things like that. I was ordering food in Chinese and it was all fluent and stuff. But the minute I arrived back to Singapore, it just switched off. And so I'm just curious though, from your perspective, is it possible to have two competing or two very different languages in one's mind at the same time?
Why not? I think, I don't know how this actually came about, because this reminds me of, I don't know if you remember a long time ago when Lee Kuan Yew was talking about his bilingual journey. There was one excerpt that actually stuck out, and to be honest, I kind of laughed because he talked about the brain, and this was when he was trying to get people to get into the Speak Mandarin campaign back in the 70s. And then over the years, every time the Speak Mandarin campaign came on during the month, he would sort of say something, encourage people to, be part of the campaign and whatnot. So one of the things that actually was brought up was that the brain is like a computer. And there is a limited amount of gigabytes in your brain. I'm not completely quoting him directly,
sure.
Kind of that story, right? So and therefore, if you only have that limited amount of brain space, then make sure that you put in the languages that matter, sort of. So therefore, English is really important because that's what everyone had to go to school in, and it's kind of the language that you have to operate in. And Mandarin was important as well for the Chinese and for the Malay. And your brain could only do this much. So therefore, there is just that much space for you to have. And I wonder though if that's the kind of idea that you want to push for, because certainly it's not true, right? That the brain is, there is no evidence whatsoever to indicate that your brain is capable of only that language space. Lots and lots. And there are multilingual people. There are people who are capable of 10 languages or 20. And certainly there are different people who are able to function very well in different languages. But Chris, I get your point about how you kind of when a language takes over, you sort of adopt a whole different. I think that's kind of different. I have a student, actually really interesting. I haven't seen her for a very long time. She was my ex-student, and she's now working in one of the government ministries. She was an excellent English speaker. She still is, I'm sure, except that I didn't hear her speak English. And Singaporean, and she's a very gifted language learner. So she taught herself Korean. Basically now she can do translations in Korean.
Wow.
Like that. And she taught herself Japanese, and so she is really, really good Japanese, Korean, English translator. And she's working in one of the government agencies now. It's been posted to a Chinese desk, right? So she's actually in charge of all these foreign dignitaries and whatnot. I don't exactly know what she does, but I know she does it. Can't tell me, I suppose, classified information. So anyway, we met up and she came to visit and we had lunch, and then it was 2 years the last time we met, and now she's completely Chinese. I didn't even know that she spoke Chinese so well. And then she admitted to me that she basically thinks and breathes and speaks Chinese all the time because her work actually demanded her to be completely Chinese. Not that it meant anything. It's just that there is a whole certain kind of adoption of habits and possibly even just cultural norms that comes with it. So I asked her, I said, well, then what happened to all that Korean stuff? And I remember when she was a student, when she was in this whole Korean phase, she even looked Korean. like many of my colleagues actually said, oh, gee, you know, that student of yours, is she Korean? I'm like, no, she's a Singaporean, and Singaporean can be. So I think I get your point, right? There's this whole adoption of cultural habit of sort, but I don't think it has anything to do with the mind. I think the whole brain space thing is a myth. They're completely capable of multiple languages, and certainly when you are more used to speaking one language, you start to adopt certain norms, and I suppose that's perfectly normal.
Thank you so much for that, Ying. Actually, then I have a follow-up question just before.
Yep.
I think it links very nicely to Hazira. And thank you so much for pointing out that myth and to have this conversation with us too. I think it's highly educational for our viewers and our listeners as well. I'm just curious from your perspective, is there any way we can inculcate a certain sense of agility of language adoption for students? Yeah, just curious about your perspective on that.
Right. Someone has asked me that before, but didn't quite phrase it the same way. It's not so much agility, but I like the idea of agility. I'm just not sure if agility is something that can be learned or something that actually can be cultivated. But if you ask me what is the best way to allow students or kids or anyone in general to have better grasp of multiple languages, be it whatever language that may be, I think one of the most important criteria is really the interest and the passion for actually wanting to learn that language. And I don't know how one can try to promote that. I think being pragmatic Singaporeans, one way of doing it is to drive home the message that every new language that you learn is an asset. So it's basically cash in your hands because it's knowledge, right? Doesn't matter what it is. An extra language is extra cash in your hands. Go with it. I think the problem now with the school system, and it goes back to this whole mother tongue thing as well, is that every child you come across who actually doesn't like mother tongue classes, and that's what they say, I don't like attending mother tongue classes.
Guilty.
Right? And
very guilty.
I'm like,
Guilty.
well, you see, that's where the problem is, because people don't actually say, I don't like attending Chinese classes, or I don't like attending Malay classes. I don't like attending mother tongue classes. So the mother tongue becomes a really bad word, simply because this is a mother tongue that is not yours. And it's also a mother tongue that's been imposed on you because you were made to do it, and you were made to believe that this is your mother tongue. But the minute you remove that notion and say, hey, you know what? This is one language that you can learn, pick anyone. So have a bilingual education system. We have a few, and these are all good languages. No language is bad, by the way, right? So these are all good choices. Pick two, okay? And you ask yourself, what can I do with this? And I think once you arrive at the answer, you get the motivation to actually do something with it. And there is no kind of a burden. At the moment now, it's like, I am betraying my culture if I don't do well in mother tongue. I am not Malay if I don't speak Malay well. There's just so much guilt trapping. Why call it a mother tongue when it is not yours? Just leave it open, right? We need 2 languages, go deal, do it. And make it 3 or 4, whatever. And I think the list is endless, really. And once you open up the possibilities, we really truly become a multilingual nation. And I think so far bilingual education has really served us well. Let's face it, Singaporeans are well positioned. Okay. And I think for most of us who actually ventured out of Singapore and managed to sort of sell ourselves, one of the things that I often get as like, oh, you're so lucky to be Singaporean because you can speak different languages. And I mean, I'm proud of that. It's great. But not every child during the school going age actually feel the same way or can see that there are lots of opportunities out there when you actually have multiple languages. The education system is not bad. The bilingual system and its rationale is not bad either. I think it's just all the trapping that makes it just so heavy that doesn't allow the child or the parents to even have space to explore. I think once you remove all of that, then enjoy the process. So when you enjoy the process, what's there not to like, right?
Thank you for that. Like, I think originally we had a final question about shifting mother tongue policy. So because in the article you suggested, right, why can't we just let children pick a second language that they would rather learn versus having a state assigned mother tongue?
Yeah.
And I think that's been addressed like quite a bit, especially in the last part that you shared about how picking a language doesn't necessarily mean, okay, and the original question I had was related to, I guess, this loss of this perceived loss of cultural connect.
Yeah.
But I think in your sharing you've indicated that just you might not have that connection to the language that has been assigned to you in the first place. So this is an opportunity for you to pick one that might be a language that you might actually have a connection with,
Or might not be. It might be just something that can allow you to make money. I don't know, or something. I mean, I know of so many people who actually are very fluent speakers of something else, of another language, right? And these people are always driven by something external. And they're very successful speakers. So it could be like, I really want to go to this school, and this school doesn't allow entrance unless I have XYZ languages. So I have a motivation to do that. So I'm going to make sure that I do really, really well. And many of these people are adult learners of languages too. So, and I think in Singapore, we are in such a perfect position because we have so many different languages to play with, right? And I think as long as people start to see that languages actually can give them a leg up, then we are set.
Thank you for that. Chris, do you have any last questions before you summarize this? Because honestly, in the interest of time, we're approaching our.
I have the enviable task of summarizing this supremely rich discussion, right, Ying Ying and Hazira. I don't really have much any last questions, but I think I will weave it in like some of my comments and learning points in the summary. But really, Ying Ying, thank you so much for your generosity. I was just sharing with Hazira in a previous conversation or so that I feel very privileged to be just a fly on the wall to listen to such conversations because I feel so enriched by the learning. Oh my gosh, it's fantastic. And I couldn't help but feel that over and over again in our conversation today, especially in what you shared in, especially as a linguistics professor, I think, I don't know whether the following quote will rub you off the wrong way, but it's the first thing that came to my mind. The one by Nelson Mandela, right? If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that it goes to his head. You speak to a man in his own language, it goes to his heart, right? And I just wonder, all that you shared so far, perhaps the end point is for us Singaporeans and residents of Singapore to learn a language in which we are able to connect at the heart level, at the heartfelt level, in the world, right? We speak about a global citizen, being a global citizen. Perhaps it's also a heartfelt citizen where we are able to speak to people in that sense. Then just like, there's this very funny show, The Three Idiots, right? There's this one quote also, don't chase success, chase excellence, because success will keep running after you. I think similarly, if you're able to speak a language that connects at the heartfelt level, perhaps in my mind, the successes will then come, thereafter. But I thought before I summarize the conversation, whether you had any insights and responses to that last
And what would you think is the language that would connect?
I think the language of empathy.
What would that be, right? I mean, practically speaking, I think usually when people ask me all these things, one of the things that always gets thrown back to me was that, okay, then what now? right?
Right.
What are we left with? And I think especially when it comes to the idea of ownership, are we at any stage, in some sense, are we at the stage where we can actually make claims that this language is ours? And what would that language be? Yeah. I don't claim to have an answer. And I think the ultimate endpoint for me would be that we will all arrive at the same answer at the same time. And it doesn't really matter what the language is, right? So time will tell, and I think it's a whole evolutionary process that we will all get there together. But I think we really should possibly step back a little, and this is possibly also a good time, it's National Day, and to also think about a whole Singaporean concept of what does it mean to have a Singaporean language. People have asked me this, right? What is so pan-Singaporean? And I'm like, well, ask ourselves, what connects? Okay, so far it has always been these 4 languages, and all these 4 languages, with the exception of English, has always been tied to our ethnic. So to a large extent, the whole ethnicity-based language policy has maintained harmony, okay, which I think has done a great job. But at the same time, I think we have also reached a really, really good point where I think ethnic differences possibly don't matter so much anymore, which is a really, really good thing. That we should start thinking about what it really means to be Singaporean. And which is why when I was writing on all this, the real question really is, what is the Singaporean mother tongue? And I don't mean what is the Singaporean mother tongue for the Malay speaker, or what is the Singaporean mother tongue for the Chinese speaker. Literally, what does it mean to be a mother tongue for the Singaporean? Right? It could be English. I think my research actually suggests that I think we are getting to the point where English is taking that space, but perhaps slightly premature because we haven't have, I don't know, enough of the self-confidence to actually adopt this and say, you know what, I'm proud to actually say this. And a lot of this has to do with, I've written in other places as well, this deep sense of insecurity about how we sound, how we speak. I'm not white, how can English be mine? And I can't do anything about it if everyone thinks this way. So my job really is just to present to people that there is something that is internally conflicting, and we really need to get over ourselves. And as Singaporeans, I think together there is a good time and a good space for us to get together and arrive at the point where we have this language or a set of languages that we can say, yeah, you know what, this is ours, and this is Singaporean.
I think on that note, Ying Ying, just to add on to what you shared and to summarize our amazing conversation today, really, I think I can summarize it in 3 main points. The first one is that I really appreciated, I possibly speak for Hazira as well, when you mentioned that the mother tongue is such a loaded term, and that there's certain kinds of connotation that has been attached to it over time that really requires some form of rethinking, reflection, and decoupling. And I think, even when I look back at my school days or so many times I groan about, going for mother tongue class, but reframing it a little bit, I think makes such a significant difference in what you shared. The next point also is this beautiful idea of inheritance and potentially tracing back our lineage. I'm biased given that I majored in history in undergraduate. So generally these things always gets me excited, and Hazira too. So clearly our sample size is very biased, but nonetheless, it is important in getting a sense of one's tapestry of identity. And I think that's something that became very clear to me, Ying Ying, when you were sharing that. Even though you didn't say it explicitly, I think implicitly the points that you were raising stem from a very abundant growth mindset that you bring about to our conversation. Meaning, for example, it is not just one. Don't be too satisfied with just one. Be okay with multiplicity. Be okay with complexity. Be okay with more. And I think that's a beautiful narrative that maybe our students, our educators, and our listeners can potentially experience a bit more in their lives. Because that brings me to my concluding point about your sharing today, which, by the way, is once again very rich. And I think summarizing it potentially might come across as being simplifying things too much. So sorry. But I think the point of bringing it to the classroom and getting students to be interested in the language, I think the example that you raised about your previous student of learning Japanese, self-teaching herself Korean, and now speaking Chinese fluently, I think that maybe the larger question that I'm hearing from Ying is, how then do we generate interest in language that connects at the heart level? And it's something that, especially like what Ying said, is something that maybe is poignant for us to reflect about in National Day season. Yeah. So back to you, Hazira.
Thank you, Chris. No, I think both of us really enjoyed this sharing. Mostly because it gave us a lot to think about, and I think it's also one of those sharings that gives us a lot to think about, relative to our own lives as well. Especially because like language learning is so personal. And I think of all my friends who have decided to go beyond the two languages and have decided to pick up several others, and how interest really drives that. But anyway, thank you, Ying Ying, for this conversation.
No
we really enjoyed it, and this is this week's episode of the Birthday Salon. There will be more coming. Please stay tuned. Enjoy. Okay. Bye.
Bye.